With the recent product reveals at Toy Fair 2025 showing the relaunches of both Mask and Gem and the holograms from the loyal subjects, it got me thinking about some of the other most memorable action figure revivals in toy history. While some very popular brands such as Transformers and Ninja Turtles have never left toy aisles since their inception in the 1980s, many other successful action figure franchises have gone on a lengthy hiatus at one time or another during their lifespan. With today's producers of pop culture merchandise being seemingly addicted to nostalgia, it's not surprising that many of the best 70s and 80s toy lines have experienced a relaunch at one time or another. Sometimes these toy revivals are hugely successful, and occasionally they even surpass the original run. Yet other times they fall short of fan expectations, despite being very well intentioned. So let's take a look at the 10 most memorable action figure relaunches in toy history. Stay tuned.
Come with me, toy fans.
Hey toy fans, my name is Tony and welcome back to the Analog Toys YouTube channel. And kicking us off in the number 10 slot is Mask. Kenner's original Mask toy line ran from 1985 to 1988, and the range was focused on a fleet of vehicles that featured hidden gimmicks, which would transform the various modes of transportation from everyday vehicles into mobile combat-ready assault platforms. This brand was quite successful in the 1980s, and fans have been clamouring to see Mask return to toy store shelves for many years. And they are almost here. At this year's New York Toy Fair, the loyal subjects unveiled their initial wave of relaunched Mask products, and these include Condor with Brad Turner, the Thunderhawk with Matt Tracker, Miles Mayhem and the Switchblade, and the biggest toy of them all, the Rhino. Only time will tell if this relaunch toy line will be successful, but at first glance, I do like that they are sticking to the original scale, and the updated figure articulation is very welcome. Yet many long-time fans of the franchise have already collected the vintage toys. For example, I acquired all 4 of these vehicles ages ago, so I feel as though the loyal subjects are underserving many of the brand's most dedicated supporters, as they'll likely pass on the toys that they already own. My advice is to offer something in the next wave that Kenner never released back in the day, like the Shark with Gloria Baker, as that will bring in the hardcore fandom and give this relaunch Mask toy line its best shot at being successful. Coming in at number 9 on our list is Action Man. Palitoy's original Action Man is widely regarded as the most popular British boys toy in history, and the line was hugely successful, running for an impressive 18 years, from 1966 to 1984. Where most toy lines come to an end due to poor retail sales, Action Man was still performing quite well in 1984, and this range was only shut down because General Mills, who had owned Palitoy since 1968, decided to cease all development of new products in the UK. This iconic British brand would remain AWOL from toy shops for the rest of the decade, during which time Hasbro managed to acquire all of Palitoy's trademarks, and they eventually brought Action Man back in 1993, but he wasn't quite the same as he used to be. Under Hasbro's tenure, Action Man stuck to being 12 inches tall, and he retained the signature scar on his cheek. But the American toy giant steered the character away from his military adventure origins, and into the realm of an extreme sports eco-warrior type. Fans of the original Action Man frequently ridiculed this new style, with his bowling ball-sized hands, silly gimmicks, and penchant for ninja costumes. Yet while the old school were dissatisfied, Hasbro's relaunch was massively popular with the children of the 90s, turning this new line into one of the most beloved domestic toy brands the UK had ever seen. And Action Man rode this wave of popularity well into the new millennium. For the number 8 entry on our list, we have McFarlane's Superpowers line. Kenner's original Superpowers toy line consists of some of the most beautiful, eye-catching action figures ever created. And while they were very popular back in the 1980s, the range was relatively short-lived. A few years ago, the Superpowers line was brought back by current DC toy license holder McFarlane. Yet the toys were initially met with disappointment, due to the figures being out of scale with the originals. Fortunately though, this was one of those rare cases where a toy manufacturer actually listened to the fandom, and later waves introduced figures that were 4.5 inches in height, bringing them back into scale with the vintage Kenner range. For McFarlane's line of Superpowers, the company did away with the action feature gimmicks that were a staple of the Kenner run, but not many people complained about this, since the gimmicks often hindered the articulation of the originals. The real strong suit of this relaunch line is that even though McFarlane has given us many classic characters, They've also provided a huge assortment of action figures that were never made by Kenner back in the 1980s. And this is what loyal subjects needs to do with Mask if they want it to appeal to their biggest fan base. However, with the news that Mattel may have wrestled the DC toy rights away from McFarlane, the future of this relaunch line remains uncertain.
Do or do not. There is no try.
At number 7 we have the Doctor Who range from Character Options. The very first line of Doctor Who action figures were released by Denys Fisher in the mid-1970s, and I recently acquired both the Tom Baker Doctor Who doll and the TARDIS playset. This is a highly collectible yet quite limited toy line that only remained in British toy shops for a couple of years. The next range of Doctor Who action figures released were produced by a company called Dapol, who started making these toys in 1988. Unfortunately though, Dapol's range was very cheaply made and the figures are quite ugly, and it would be years before Doctor Who would again see a worthwhile range of action figures. Yet when the television show was revived in the early 2000s, toy company Character Options Limited took another stab at manufacturing Doctor Who action figures, and the line is still going strong today. This company has held the master toy license for the franchise since 2005, and it pleases me to no end that the range is being produced by a homegrown British toy company. Over the last 20 years this toy line has gone very deep into Doctor Who, not only producing characters from each new TV series, but also going through the Doctor's back catalogue, by producing very nice renditions of every Doctor, and a vast cast list of other figures and creatures. And now it's question time for you, dear viewer. What other classic toy lines would you like to see make a comeback? Leave us a comment in the section below, and while you're at it, why not consider subscribing to the channel? It would help us out a lot, and I would really appreciate it. Now at number 6 on our list of the most memorable action figure relaunches is Mego. Technically this isn't a relaunch toy line, as Mego is a toy company and not a specific range of figures. But back in the 1970s, Mego dominated the action figure aisles, with licenses such as Star Trek, Planet of the Apes and even Chips. Not to mention the fact that they also held both the DC Comics and Marvel toy licenses. What was unique about Mego at that time is that all the figures used the same body types, regardless of the franchise that the figures were based upon. For this reason, there are many collectors who say that they are Mego collectors, as opposed to saying, I collect Action Jackson or I collect Planet of the Apes, and this is why I've allowed them to sneak their way onto this list. After Mego's huge success in the 1970s, the company started to see a significant decline in sales, and they had no choice but to file for bankruptcy in 1982. Then in July of 2018, the newly reformed Mego Corporation announced that they would be producing a limited run of their classic style clothed dolls. This relaunch line of Mego figures remains very popular, and I find the lower cost of the dolls to be a very welcome distraction from the other more expensive collector targeted product that is being pushed into toy stores today. Coming in at number 5, we have the Action Force toy line from Valaverse. When Palitoy first introduced the Action Force toy line in 1982, it was a scaled down version of their popular Action Man range, and it was designed to compete with Star Wars in the 3 3/4 inch scale. However, in 1983, Palitoy introduced a storyline, which played out in the pages of the Battle Action Force comics, where the Z-Force, Q-Force, Space Force and SAS teams would do battle with an enemy faction known as the Red Shadows. This reboot of the franchise was incredibly popular, and for a while there, Palitoy's Action Force really gave the Star Wars line a run for its money in British toy stores. Yet sadly this brand also came to an abrupt end for the same reason that production was ceased on Action Man. Hasbro did revive the trademark in 1987 when they brought their G.I. Joe range to the UK, but this only lasted a few years before they gave up and just started calling the line G.I. Joe in Britain too. Fast forward to 2021 and toy company Valaverse released their first series of all new Action Force figures, which are now produced in the 6-inch scale. The trademark had been secured after Hasbro let it slip in the early 2000s, and for this new line, Valaverse have rebooted the mythology, just like Palitoy did back in 1983. With exciting new hero characters and a cast of wonderfully designed villains, this relaunched Action Force line gets bigger and better with each new series, and it is one of the greatest success stories of any independent toy maker operating in modern times. The number 4 entry on this list goes to Hasbro's Indiana Jones line that was introduced in 2008. Kenner's Adventures of Indiana Jones is one of the most underrated action figure lines of the 1980s, And while I have often commented on how good this toy assortment was, it failed to resonate with children in 1982 and was quickly cancelled. Then LJN had a crack of the indie action figure whip by producing a very limited run of Temple of Doom characters, but they didn't set retail sales alight either. The failure of both of these toy lines resulted in us never receiving any Last Crusade figures in 1989, and we would have to wait almost 2 decades before Hasbro finally stepped into the fray. Their attempt remains the most extensive range of Indiana Jones themed action figures ever produced, and if you want the full rundown of the entire line, then I highly recommend watching Indiana Jones and the Last Hurrah on the Retro Blasting YouTube channel. You'll find a link in the video description below. To coincide with the release of Dial of Destiny in 2023, Hasbro released a 6-inch Indiana Jones line called the Adventure Series. Yet even though collectors had been crying out for indie figures to be produced in this scale, a series of poor design choices and some very lame character selections led to the line bombing at retail, making Hasbro's 2008 range the best Indiana Jones action figure relaunch in toy history. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, I really hope it's because you enjoy the content that we make here at Analog Toys. And if you'd like to see us continuing to make this type of quality content, then please consider supporting us on Patreon. With 4 different tiers ranging from $1 to $10 a month, your pledge will get you instant access to hours of exclusive content and a host of other benefits, such as 24 hours of early access to all our new feature videos, just like this one. It's quick and easy to join, and your pledge goes a long way into helping us produce quality videos for everyone to enjoy. You'll find a link to our Patreon in the video description below. Now, as we get closer to the top slot, the number 3 entry goes to the Masters of the Universe Origins line. Mattel's He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was one of the big 3 toy properties of the 1980s, with the other 2 being Transformers and G.I. Joe, and the line has seen numerous relaunches over the past 3 decades. Yet none of these have come as close to recapturing the magic of Mattel's original as the Origins line that was first launched in 2019. The vintage Masters of the Universe toy line was centered around a range of science fiction fantasy action figures that stood 5.5 inches tall, and all of them were extremely muscular in appearance. These figures all came with incorporated play features that started out quite simple, like the spring-loaded waist function, yet these gimmicks grew more outlandish as the line progressed. Back in the 80s, Mattel seemed obsessed with making each play feature more preposterous than the last, even though all us kids really wanted was superior articulation. And this was the genius of the Origins line. When Mattel launched the brand in 2019, the action figures were produced in the same scale as the originals, with all of the same proportions and styling. Yet this time around they came with knee, ankle, wrist and elbow joints that were not present on their vintage counterparts. Fans of the franchise were overjoyed with the new type of Motu action figure. So it's quite a shame that over the last few years, the line has descended into a run of weird character choices and hard to find exclusives. In the penultimate slot, we have the Star Wars Power of the Force line. No one can argue that Kenner's original Star Wars range wasn't one of the greatest action figure lines to ever grace our popular culture. Yet following the conclusion of the first trilogy of movies, the company struggled to keep the brand alive in toy stores, and the production of Star Wars action figures was halted in 1985. We wouldn't see any new Star Wars toys for the rest of the decade, and in 1991 Hasbro would acquire the Kenner Toy Company. A few years later, Hasbro decided to bring the granddaddy of all toy lines back to life. While still using the Kenner logo, Hasbro released the first new Star Wars action figures the world had seen in 10 years, when the Power of the Force line was finally released in 1995. The line has been dubbed Power of the Force 2 by most collectors, to avoid confusing it with the 1985 Power of the Force line released by Kenner. And despite being a phenomenal retail success, fans ridiculed the early figures because of their overly muscular physiques. Fortunately, Hasbro soon course-corrected this, and the line went on to become bigger and better than the original. Unless you were there in the toy trenches back in 1995, it can be very difficult to explain just how significant this toy relaunch was. This new Star Wars range managed to capture the attention of a whole new generation of children, whilst also drawing in the adults who once played with the original Kenner figures in their childhoods. And I truly believe that the Power of the Force 2 line is largely responsible for bringing the toy collecting hobby into the mainstream. Now, before we reveal our top pick, we have time for a single honourable mention. And that goes to Captain Action. This 1960s toy line from Ideal was very similar to G.I. Joe, in that it employed a 12-inch figure that could be dressed in a variety of different outfits. However, where G.I. Joe was focused on military sets, Captain Action could be dressed in a series of comic hero costumes. The line was quite short-lived, but is fondly remembered, and it was brought back in the late 1990s by the Praying Mantis Toy Company. This relaunch produced some excellent figures throughout its run, and the best part is that they are still quite affordable to collect today. And so, coming in at number 1 is the most memorable action figure relaunch in toy history, G.I. Joe. The G.I. Joe toy line has been cancelled and relaunched more times than I can remember, and it is currently seeing a renewed period of success with the 6-inch classified series line. With Joe returning to active duty so many times, it can be hard to nail down which particular relaunch is the most memorable. But for me, it has to be the original G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero from 1982. Hasbro first introduced G.I. Joe in 1964, and at that time he was a military hero who came from the 4 branches of US service: the Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines. This was a revolutionary toy for its time, and G.I. Joe is now recognised as the world's first action figure. Yet by the end of the 1960s, the anti-war sentiment surrounding the conflict in Vietnam meant that military toys were no longer in favour, so G.I. Joe needed to change course if he wanted to survive. In the 1970s, G.I. Joe formed the Adventure Team, and he would continue to remain popular in toy aisles for the next several years. However, even though G.I. Joe survived Vietnam, he wasn't strong enough to survive an oil crisis and the increasing cost of producing petroleum-based plastic products, and the line was cancelled in 1977. The franchise lay dormant for the next 5 years, before Hasbro not only relaunched the line, but completely revamped it, when they introduced the all-new G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero range in 1982. Inspired by the success of Kenner's Star Wars range, this new line of G.I. Joe action figures were produced in the 3 3/4 inch scale, and Hasbro also introduced a storyline with exciting new characters. A story that children could learn about by reading the adventures printed on the pages of Marvel's new G.I. Joe comic. Throughout the rest of the 1980s and well into the 1990s, this toy line continued to expand in scope and popularity, and it arguably surpassed its original incarnation within its first few years in toy stores. This was also the first time anything like this had been attempted, and it was so successful that Hasbro literally wrote the playbook on how exactly to make a toy revival work. And with that kind of recognition, I can honestly say that G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero is the most memorable relaunch in action figure history. So that's our top 10 most memorable action figure relaunches in toy history. And if you enjoyed this video, you can click the links over here to check out some of our other top 10 lists. Or subscribe to the channel by clicking down here, or consider supporting us on Patreon, where you'll get access to hours of exclusive content. I'm Tony from Analog Toys, and I'll see you in the next video.